We are tier ranking every single spell in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. My name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes. And today we're going to keep working through the first level spells.
Up on screen right now, you're going to see the rankings that we use for all the spells in D&D. But in short, S tier are must-have spells. A tier are ones that you should consider if you have access to them. B tier are useful in a lot of situations, but may be not as good as some of the other options. C tier are very niche, or there might be specific use cases where they are useful, but generally they're hard to use. And D tier spells are traps that you should avoid.
And speaking of such traps and hazards that are best left avoided, in our adventures, we like to make sure that we have the right tools to prepare for whatever dangers we face. And we like to have that as well when we're browsing the internet too. Just like casting the right spells and protective wards can save your adventure, having the right technology can keep you protected when you're browsing the wide and adventurous world of the internet.
One spell that all of you wizards out there should have always prepared is NordVPN. I personally use NordVPN on my home computer to deal with the fact that I do a lot of uploading, downloading, and streaming. And sometimes I get throttled by my ISP for downloading so much, but NordVPN keeps things flowing pretty smooth for me.
I go everywhere with my laptop, whether I'm in a coffee shop or a hotel or my favorite local game store. I like to make sure that when I'm connecting to the local Wi-Fi network, I'm doing so securely because I have so much important information kept on my computer, not the least of which is my Dungeon Master notes. NordVPN helps make sure that my computer is completely secure even when I'm traveling across different Wi-Fi networks and knowing that no one else is spying in on my data while I'm using the web.
So if you want to protect yourself with NordVPN the way that a wizard protects themselves with mage armor, head on over to nordvpn.com/dungeondudes.
There's even a great deal on right now where you get 4 extra months on a 2-year plan when you sign up over at nordvpn.com/dungeondudes.
Thank you so much to NordVPN for sponsoring this video. And now let's get on to the first level spells. Starting where we left off last time, we're looking at another spell suited for paladins out there, and that is Compelled Duel.
Compelled Duel is a bonus action spell that a paladin can cast, forcing the target to make a wisdom saving throw, or else it has to fight the paladin. For the duration of the spell, it has disadvantage on attack rolls against everybody other than you, and if it wants to move to a space that is more than 30 feet away from you, it has to make a wisdom saving throw, otherwise it can't move there.
There are a few restrictions with this spell because the duel needs to be honored. You need to honor your end of that. They are compelled to fight you, but you can't fight anybody but them, and your party can't interfere either. If your party starts attacking the target, the spell is void.
This makes it a very tricky spell to use. If there wasn't the provision that your party members would end the spell by attacking the target, it would be way more powerful, as more of a taunt, right? So that element of it, I've seen a lot of cases where there was a single monster and the paladin used Compelled Duel, and then the rest of the party just proceeded to attack the single monster, which voids the spell. So what this spell is best used for is when the paladin kind of wants to pull a target away from the rest of the enemies while the party deals with the rest of the foes at the same time. That makes it a very tricky spell to use, despite how potent the effect can be.
I do think that early game, this is actually a moderately functional control spell. And when I say control spell, what I actually use this for is the paladin is usually not only one of the heaviest hitters at the table, but they're also usually one of the most defendable people at the table. Whether it's your goblin boss or your bandit captain, usually you have one big dude and a few minions. You can let your party clean up the minions while you point at the big dude and say, hey, you and me, let's go, allowing them to focus their attention on you, not doing much damage to your allies, leaving your allies to clean up the little thugs along the way.
There's another flaw with the spell, though. It requires concentration and draws a target to attack you. This means that even if a target fails its wisdom saving throws and is otherwise compelled by the spell, the target can break the spell and thus end the duel by attacking you, damaging you, and making you fail your concentration check. This really, really, really makes the spell less useful than you would want it to otherwise be, I think, because you still took that damage, like in the absolute worst case scenario with the spell, what happens is the target was going to attack you anyways. They smash you with their club. You take a bunch of damage and fail your concentration check, and you just spent your bonus action and your spell slot for very little.
You could have used that spell slot to smite on your turn and probably kill the target.
Exactly. And because it's a bonus action spell that requires concentration, you can't use all your fun smite spells while this spell is in effect. I think for me, I give Compelled Duel a C.
I agree with the C. Although there are niche cases where it's quite a fun spell to pull off, it's actually quite difficult to pull off, and it's not useful in as many situations as you think it would be.
Indeed. It's not that the effect can't be good in the right circumstances. It's just that it's a surprisingly narrow window where it is. When you have the right circumstances, when you've got that big, low wisdom monster that maybe doesn't have very accurate attacks and is going to miss with lots of its attacks against you, or you've got a really good concentration modifier yourself so that you know you're not going to lose concentration on the spell, it's great to be able to pull that target away and fight them one-on-one while your party deals with the other enemies. But that's not a common case.
I will say the other case where I use this, again, it doesn't happen that often, but if the big monster manages to make its way through the front line and to the squishy wizard or the sorcerer and are pummeling on them, you can command it to say, get away from my friend and fight somebody your own size, which is actually quite useful because pulling an enemy off of one of your weaker targets could be extremely useful. But these are niche.
These are, because I think for a lot of paladins, the choice is always going to be, do you compel them to a duel or do you simply smite them to death? Next up is Comprehend Languages, a classic ritual spell that is, I think, the cornerstone of many Divination Wizard spellbooks.
This is available for bards, sorcerers, warlocks, and wizards, and it allows you to, as is written on the tin, you can read or understand text or somebody speaking to you in any language. However, that doesn't make you able to speak any language back.
So Comprehend Languages is one of those, some dungeon masters will make it relevant, and it will be irrelevant in many other campaigns. It's a ritual spell, and so casting it as a ritual is low risk, which means I think it's kind of an automatic B for that reason alone. But it really is much more of a talk to your dungeon master if the spell is actually going to be relevant and useful. Because I think a lot of situations come up where you encounter the strange alien language and Comprehend Languages doesn't work on it because it's written in a cipher or a code, or the dungeon master rules that it's some kind of ancient unknown language that not even the magic can reveal, or the spell only reveals the literal meaning of the text and the text is highly metaphorical or something like that. So for me, it's like a plot spell. I feel like...
I do think that there are a lot of useful cases if you're running a pretty standard campaign, in the sense that you have a party of players, none of them took Elven, but you're about to go on an adventure into Elven ruins. Or you're going into the ancient dwarf city that's been abandoned, but nobody in your party's a dwarf or speaks Dwarven. In these pretty standard languages, where it's like, I need to read signposts or understand a map or figure out where we're going in this dungeon that is completely designed by a race that nobody has the language proficiency that they need, that's when this spell becomes very, very useful. But it is up to the DM on whether those are happening.
I've just never seen this spell used to reveal critical information that the party couldn't find otherwise. And using it in a social situation is of limited value because you don't have the ability to speak the language back. In general, I think that this is a spell that's ranking is going to be entirely dependent on the style of campaign you're running and the way your dungeon master and your group treats different languages in your campaign. I tend to not put language barriers up between my players and my NPCs in my game, so in my style. So like, I would say if you're playing with Monty, Comprehend Languages is pretty useless. Because just in my DMing style, I just generally don't make that an obstacle in many ways.
I have comprehend languages, and I will say in your campaign, I think I've cast it twice, but that's twice in 15 levels of play. So.
Yeah. So again, I would just say that this is one of those things where, as a DM, just tell your players how you rank the spell. Like, how important is it going to be in your campaign? Because it's going to vary.
I agree with the B ranking. It might be useful depending on a lot of circumstances. Next up, we come to Create or Destroy Water, which is available for clerics and druids. This allows you to, once again, as labeled on the tin, create or destroy water.
Can I use this spell to destroy all the water in someone's body or instantly fill someone's lungs with water?
Absolutely. That's why it's a first level spell, because it causes insta-death.
This is amazing. It is S tier.
S tier, best spell in the game, kills everybody without any effort.
So it doesn't do that. Create or Destroy Water just fills an open container with water. And if your definition of open container includes a human body, I think you're being too generous with this spell.
This is not a spell that should do damage or attack anybody, but it can still be useful. And the Destroy Water feature does let you get rid of fog, which can be actually pretty useful for places where you don't have great visibility.
Yeah, and you could make it fall as rain. I mean, this spell is amazing in Baldur's Gate 3 because Baldur's Gate 3 has the wet condition. But in Dungeons & Dragons, that isn't a very relevant thing in tabletop. I think that this is, again, the territory of a C-level spell. In a survival game, it's an automatic win.
Yeah.
And maybe there's certain circumstances where a creative player will find a specific use for engaging with the environment in some specific way, where this spell is an amazing tool for the job. Barring those rare situations, it doesn't really have a standard adventuring use.
Let's talk about some of the use case scenarios where this is really useful. Are you playing in a desert exploration campaign where you will be monitoring your rations and water intake over the course of traveling through a very large desert? Create or Destroy Water is going to save your life.
And it's probably been banned by the DM. Because that's kind of the problem, is like the campaign where this spell is useful and relevant. In that campaign, it's such an S tier spell that it almost spoils that element of the game, and you're just as likely to see spells like Goodberry and Create or Destroy Water just get outright banned by the DM.
That's true. If your DM has written a campaign that's main focus is survival in the desert, and you have somebody in your party who took Goodberry and Create or Destroy Water, then the DM just goes, okay, never mind. So I'm going to agree with the C.
Yeah, it's C. C4 has creative uses, but it's probably pretty rare. Next up is Cure Wounds. Bards, clerics, druids, rangers, artificers. Did I miss anybody? A lot of classes get the spell. Unless you're a sorcerer, warlock, or wizard. I think you're out of luck.
Divine Soul Sorcerer, maybe. Cure Wounds is kind of the poster child for healing spells before Healing Word came and kicked it off of its podium. But Cure Wounds is
bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a bad spell. Cure Wounds does 1d8 points of healing plus your proficiency modifier with one action to cast and a range of touch, which means you have to walk up to somebody and cure them. For the immediate shift to a bonus action plus gaining a range, you exchange that d4 for that d8 and you still get your spellcasting ability modifier with Healing Word. I personally feel that Cure Wounds is D tier because of the existence of Healing Word.
I think that the problem with Cure Wounds is, we've talked about this a lot. Baldur's Gate 3 aside, where healing is much more useful, in our D&D games, being a healer who's there to try to top people up while combat is going on, not useful. The main use for healing is somebody's been knocked down to 0 and you need to get them back on their feet, so you use a healing spell. In all of the cases where somebody has been knocked down to 0, Healing Word is going to do a better job at getting them back up on their feet from range, because you probably don't want to be in the situation that just knocked them down. Also, if you do run up to them and you have a healing potion, you can use your action to give the player who's downed a healing potion, which saved you a spell slot. So really,
Yeah.
the use case for Cure Wounds is I don't have Healing Word available. I don't have any healing potions. And I guess I don't have a healer's kit or some other way to get this person to be stable. And yeah, it's a bit more healing, but I think whether you're using Healing Word or Cure Wounds, it's still not enough hit points for it to truly be like, oh, they're
Yeah.
back in the fight for good.
Yeah, because the difference on average between a D4 and a D8 is 2 points of healing. And the maximum difference, the kind of the delta that you can have with this is 4 points of healing. And yes, there's sometimes when that 4 points makes all the difference in the world. But past lower levels, it really might not once monsters start hitting for a lot more damage, once they start having multiple attacks per turn. That 2 to 4 extra points of healing is really rarely going to be the difference between someone living or dying. And the upcasting on Cure Wounds is also really bad. It does not scale fast enough to keep pace with the hit point pools. So the percentage of hit points that it cures gets lessened and lessened and lessened and lessened as you gain levels, even when you're upcasting it. And so I just think that unless you literally have nothing else,
I'm going to give Cure Wounds a C. Am I?
I feel like objectively the only use case for it is quite literally, I am a ranger, a paladin, or an artificer, and nobody else in the party has any healing of any kind. And as a paladin, you have lay on hands inherently as well.
If I'm a life domain cleric, it might be worth taking.
I think even with a life domain cleric, the scaling of
Even if you're pumping it up?
even if you're pumping it up, I think that Healing Word is still your better way to go. But you've got it anyways if you're a life domain cleric, because it just is part of your domain list.
True.
So you have it automatically.
So in that case, we don't need to rank it because you are taking it automatically.
Yeah, you
if
just
you're a
have to
life
have
domain.
it.
So
Yeah.
with that aside, I guess, if you're a life domain cleric, cool, you have it. If you're anybody else, I guess I'm going to give it a D.
Yeah, I think it's a D tier spell. Next up is Detect Evil and Good, a spell for clerics and paladins that, for the duration of the spell, allows you to detect the location of aberrations, celestials, elementals, fae, fiends, and undead within range. Kelly, got a guess for what the range is?
60 feet? 120 feet. 1 mile.
30 feet.
No. I've read this spell and I still didn't want to believe that.
And you know where it's located.
Okay, there is a use for this. Let me tell you what the use is, and it might be the only use. Is the person we're talking to a vampire or lich disguised as a regular person? This is the spell for you.
Yeah.
Are the zombies approaching us zombies? Yes, you don't need to cast a spell for that. Is the vampire biting my ally's neck a vampire? Yes, you don't need to cast a spell for that.
This is used to figure out if the NPC that you're interacting with is actually a monster that wants to eat you.
Yeah. That's the only use for this, which, let's be honest here. In the rare moment where this happens in your campaign and you get to undo it with this spell, you're going to feel like a champion. But is your campaign going to have this moment?
Is this another C tier spell?
I'm wondering, maybe it's C tier, but it's C minus because
it's just really rare. Okay,
it's very rare.
There is the campaign where this is super relevant.
And when it's that one campaign and that one moment where the DM thinks he's got the wool pulled over your eyes and you're not going to figure it out, and you use this spell and you figure out and you blow open the big plot reveal, you feel like the best.
Yeah, but otherwise, I just think it's really narrow. And also, if the monster is within 30 feet of you, it's already bad news bears.
Can I detect invisible creatures? Let's say there's an invisible, a shadow.
Arguably, yes. So that could be another use case for this spell, is as a sort of...
Am I about to get attacked by something I can't see?
Yes.
But that doesn't help you see it.
Or is there something hiding from me that is very close? And so That's kind of the situation. It's like, I'm in a dark room. Are there vampires about to jump out at me?
And the problem is this doesn't do anything to help you fight them. You're like, is there a vampire right behind me? Yes. Oh no. And then you get
Yeah,
attacked.
yeah,
I'm going to give it a C.
yeah. Detect magic similarly detects magic within 30 feet of you. And as an action while you're concentrating on the spell, you can focus it to see a faint magical aura around a visible creature or object that is radiating magic, and you know the school of magic that applies, if any. You can also cast this one as a ritual.
This makes it instantly better than
Yes.
detect evil or good.
I have played D&D with people who use detect magic, like, you know, in Diablo or many action RPGs where you can hold like the Alt key or the X button or something, and a bunch of the things that you can interact with in the environment get illuminated. I've played D&D with a lot of players that treat detect magic like that.
I've also seen detect magic used really, really well to just completely undo illusions, traps, and those sorts of features.
Worth noting, though, that it only senses the presence of magic and it only reveals a visible illusion.
Yeah.
So you'll know, oh yes, that thing that I see in front of me is radiating illusion magic. But if an invisible creature or object is in the room, you'll sense that there's magic there, but you won't be able to pinpoint the location because the object needs to be visible in order for the aura to appear.
Again, the fact that this is a ritual spell kind of lifts it up a bit because it requires nothing.
Yeah.
For if you're a ritual caster, if you're the wizard in the party, you take this spell just to tuck in your back pocket, and if it doesn't come up with anything, it's still not a waste of resources. If you're investigating a scene, you can just be like, I'm going to cast Detect Magic to see if anything magical is in the area. Nope. Okay, cool. Now I know that.
I think it's a cool spell to use to reveal clues to the players as well. As a dungeon master, I really like that it asks you to reveal schools of magic because that can help give your players hints as to what's happening, what's going on. I'd like to embrace it overall as a spell. I've seen, and I have been in those positions sometimes where players expect the spell to reveal more than it ought to. Again, I've played D&D, and I've played with players who would make a very strong point that they had detect magic, that they were detecting magic, that they were always looking to detect magic, as if somehow this was going to protect them from...
Almost like an anti-magic aura around them.
Well, in many ways, I've played with players who try to use detect magic almost as a way to prevent them from being surprised by a magical trap.
Yeah.
And it can do that, but I will remind players that Nistel's magic aura exists, and so dungeon masters have a spell in the game that allows trap makers to hide magic traps from detect magic. Yeah, I kind of use that justification for everything. So, sorry.
I'm gonna give Detect Magic a B.
Yeah.
I think that when it's useful, and because it's a ritual, a lot of classes can cast it without expending resources.
I think if you're a ritual caster, it's an A.
Fair.
Yeah.
If it's a ritual caster, this should be one of the first ritual spells you consider taking.
Yeah.
So yeah, A for the ritual casters. I'm gonna say B overall.
Finally, detect poison and disease.
We're detecting
Same thing.
a lot of things.
We're detecting a lot of things. This one I think is slightly more useful, especially in a social intrigue campaign. When you're worried about someone using poisoned weapons, it also detects diseases and disease-bearing creatures. I think that it solidly falls into the C range, but I feel like there's not too much else to go on here.
It's a higher C than Detect Evil and Good, in my opinion, because where Detect Evil and Good is going to detect a monster that's literally about to kill you, this can be useful for finding things that could kill you if you interact with them and allowing you to avoid that situation. Yeah. If for a role play scenario, I think that all nobles and kings and anybody who is like a high ranking person in the world probably has a court wizard or somebody who has this spell to detect poison on all of their food and drinks to make sure that nobody's trying to assassinate them.
I think one of the things with Detect Evil and Good is that if you cast the spell before you go into the environment where you're worried about someone being around, it can kind of be like an alarm system, which makes it a little bit more useful in that respect. If you're casting it immediately in the presence of the creatures that are around you, because it does have a duration.
I think that both are C.
Yeah.
And it really depends on what your campaign is on whether either of these are going to be useful.
Disguise Self.
Finally.
I feel like that Gordon Ramsay meme where he's like, finally, some good bleeping food.
Yeah.
This spell is one of my favorite spells in the game. I love it. I use it rigorously on my characters and my villains. I think it's an S tier spell. I think it just is so good.
It's available for bards, sorcerers, artificers, and there's an invocation to get it on warlocks, which, removing artificer from the equation, bards, sorcerers, and warlocks are all charisma-based spellcasters. Also, if you want to build a character that this is going to become an S tier spell on, take the actor feat and pair it with Disguise Self. If you're doing that combo, that's an S tier combo. I think overall Disguise Self gets an A for me.
I feel that in the hands of a skilled player like Joe, I have been surprised at how many situations I felt that Disguise Self would not have allowed for an infiltration where Joe pulled it off. Because one of the things that Joe does with Disguise Self is he backs it up with the actor feat. But another thing that he also often does is he will pick up the clothing and objects so that the only thing that he's actually disguising with Disguise Self is his face.
Yes.
And so when you're using it in that way to really support the illusion, Disguise Self can also be comboed with things like Detect Thoughts because it doesn't require concentration. It lasts for an hour and it only has a casting time of 1 action. A smart player using this spell will cause shenanigans.
This is one of the key components to the Master of Disguise. There's a lot of different classes and different abilities and different features that allow you to bring a Master of Disguise character to life, but all of them kind of come to this fine point in the fact that the first thing you should take is Disguise Self.
There is an argument for saying it's a B spell that becomes S tier in the hands of the right player. So I'm willing to accept the argument that it is B tier and it requires the charisma-based caster who is playing intelligently to really make it sing. It's just that I've seen what happens when bards, sorcerers, and warlocks take this spell and get up to all ends of, like, a sorcerer with subtle spell using this spell, a bard with their expertise in deception and persuasion using this spell, having a warlock that is combining the invocation that is always changing their forms. The context that it opens up for infiltration, social interaction, and more, I am constantly surprised by it. Maybe it is because I've now been running a long-term campaign with Joe using this spell, but every time he pulls this spell out, I know it's going to be a great time, and I'm just like, yep, bring it on. What do you got this time?
Okay, so I'm going to settle on A.
Okay.
I was talked into S. I felt A. You mentioned it being B. I think A is my safe bet here.
Yeah, I love it, but I acknowledge that A is probably the right place for it to be. And that is because I think that it is inherently strong, but I think that there is that counter argument is that no, it really needs support to become amazing. And so that's where I think that on its own, it opens up a lot of options and it becomes S tier as soon as you combine it with any one other thing.
Next up, we come to Dissonant Whispers, which is available mainly for bards, but also Great Old One warlocks.
You whisper something scary to someone you can see within 60 feet of you. They have to make a wisdom saving throw, and on a failed save, they have to take 3d6 psychic damage, and then they have to spend their reaction to move away from you. On a successful save, it's half damage, it doesn't move. It also doesn't run off a pit or into a fire or into a pool of acid. But that still gives the spell a lot of utility.
I might have a soft spot for this spell, and I'll say why. First of all, It's one of the spells that kind of feels defining for a bard. So although it's
Yes.
not available for every class, if you're playing a bard, this feels like a bardic spell. Not only that, but I have been in a situation that I remember in an early campaign we played in where myself and the bard were trapped in a hallway with a gelatinous cube coming towards us, and I was trying to unlock a door, while Joe, playing a bard, kept casting Dissonant Whispers, making the gelatinous cube move backwards. If it hadn't been for this spell, we would have died in that hallway, but I was able to unlock the door just for us to get through. Those little moments where actually causing a creature to back up can save the day, and it also being a defining spell of the bard, makes me want to give this an A. But remember that S tier is kind of that ranking that we give to, if you don't have access to it, you should go out of your way to like grab a feat or something to take it. This isn't that. But if you're a bard or a Great Old One's warlock, it's a really cool pickup, and I think very much worth taking.
What's really cool about the spell is that creatures that are immune to charm and fear, it's not a charm or fear effect. The only time a creature can't be affected by the spell is if they're deafened. But this is also the bard's secret damage dealing spell, because the movement caused by this spell provokes opportunity attacks. So if you're a bard and you have your fighter and your rogue up against a target and you hit them with Dissonant Whispers, they run away, and your fighter and your rogue now get to make opportunity attacks against that target. So this can actually be one of those secret bard damage dealing spells, because 3d6 psychic damage, not too bad, very rarely resisted. But if you now have your Great Weapon Master Paladin smiting on the opportunity attack that you just granted them, you did a lot of damage with a first level spell slot. So for this reason, I agree. It's an A tier spell, and it is really the bard's secret damage dealing spell.
Next up, we come to Divine Favor, which is available for Paladins and War Domain Clerics, and this allows you to add 1d4 extra radiant damage to your hits.
It's a bonus action to cast, and it lasts for 1 minute. Straight up, it competes with Bless. And 1d4 extra damage on your attacks is not as good as 1d4 extra to hit.
Now, if you have somebody else casting Bless and you have this...
Sure, but again, this is also a spell that's available to Paladins. Right. 1d4 extra damage on all of your attacks. For a first level spell, you can smite for 2d8 extra damage. Okay? So on average, a d4 is 2.5 damage. So this means that if you were attacking twice per turn for 2 turns, you would have to get, essentially you have to be able to land 4 attacks before Divine Favor is better than a smite.
A single smite.
A single smite.
So what's interesting about the math here is that part of me wants to say that like you could use this and Divine Smite. But with the calculation you presented, using even that single spell slot to then get this and then add smites on top of that would have been better spent just on 1 extra smite.
Totally. Yes, I guess you can combine it for some super burst damage, but again, you can already combine the smite spells with the smite feature as a bonus action to really spike your damage into the stratosphere.
And I think, like, with that, would you rather do this and try to get 4 attacks to equal 1 smite, or would you just rather smite on an extra attack? I think you're better off smiting. And really, when it comes to Paladins being the main use of this...
It's a D.
Yeah.
Yeah, don't bother with it. Just smite.
Next up, we come to Earth Tremor, which is available for bards, druids, sorcerers, and wizards. Earth Tremor does a little tremor around you in a 10-foot radius. You have to make a dexterity save, or you're knocked prone, and you take 1d6 damage.
It also leaves behind a permanent area of difficult terrain that lasts until it's cleared away. So it causes the little shockwave, just rubble all around you, potentially knocks people prone. I don't think this is a bad spell. I just don't think it's a great one. Like, it's in that category of Burning Hands, Thunderwave, and all those kind of like short-range AoE spells. And this one's interesting because it's leaving behind the permanent difficult terrain.
I generally don't love the spells that are like a little explosion around you
Yeah.
because I never want to be surrounded. The only spell that causes an explosion around you that I actually like is Thunderstep, because it's here's an explosion and I get to move somewhere else that I'd rather
Yeah.
be. These spells, for me, Thunderstep is I've gotten myself in a bad situation and I need to get out, which is like an emergency spell. The rest of these feel like I'm not going to cast them unless I'm surrounded, but it doesn't necessarily solve the case of me being surrounded.
Yeah, and you're at the epicenter of that difficult terrain. Like, you don't get to ignore the difficult terrain created by this spell. And while the creatures that you knocked prone are now going to have to stand up from prone and move through the difficult terrain to get to you, it just feels like a lot going on that actually doesn't add up to as much of an effect as you would want it to have. I think it's C.
Yeah, I agree with the C. I will say that this is a cool thing to do if instead of being surrounded, it is a 10-foot radius around
Yeah.
it, which means that it's actually 20 feet diameter. So if you cast it when a group of enemies are approaching you through, let's say, a 20-foot wide hallway, you have to shuffle back. They all get knocked prone. They now need to stand up and shuffle 20 feet through difficult terrain. It can be used more to like set up a slow area.
Yeah, especially if you need it to last a long time. Although I think in a lot of cases I might prefer a spell like Grease for that purpose.
Yeah, I think it's still C, but like I can see where the niche uses are that you go, oh, that was a good use of that spell.
Yeah. Next up is Ensnaring Strike. This spell is a bonus action to cast. It's available for Rangers and Oath of the Ancients Paladins. And you use it when you hit with a weapon attack, melee or ranged, and it causes vines to grow up around the target that restrain them if they fail a strength save. The creature that's restrained takes d6 piercing damage at the start of their turns, and they have to use their action to break out of the restraints.
I know that the flavor that it presents is that it's vines growing out of the ground, but I personally like to picture it like those two balls with the chain that you fire at your enemy's legs and they wrap around them and knock them over. I like the flavor of this spell, and I think that it's actually pretty cool.
I do too. I think it's also very underrated.
Nobody talks about it.
Nobody does. I think because Hunter's Mark steals the show as the Ranger damage utility concentration spell, because you do have to concentrate on the restraints. But I think it rocks. Like, you can use this on a ranged attack, shoot somebody, and they're stuck there. Strength saves are often big monsters succeed them. A large creature gets advantage on the save. But I feel like you can really exploit a creature's vulnerability and get a little bit of damage out of it in the process. And I feel like this is actually an A tier spell for a ranger. It just is so over, like, it's weird because Hunter's Mark and other things that rangers can do with their bonus action so often overshadow this.
I mean, I think because of the overshadowing, and the thing is that it is actually rightful overshadowing. It's just that there's a lot of spells actually competing for the place that this spell takes up. So this is a good spell. It's just in direct competition with a lot of other good spells. So for that reason, I'm giving it a B.
Okay. I think that's fair. I honestly think that Rangers should look at this spell more often. I actually, thinking back, I'm thinking of so many times in our campaigns where Jill could have used this spell on Veo to really great effect.
The amount of times in our campaign that a random humanoid NPC has fled the scene has been incredibly frustrating. And if you could have just knocked an arrow at them and tied them up, that could have solved everything.
So next up we have Entangle, which is only for druids, although I think Tasha's gave it to rangers as well. This spell, which is an action to cast and you concentrate on for 1 minute, conjures up the vines as well, which, as the spell describes, entangle creatures, much in the same way as Entangling Strike.
However, the major difference between this and Ensnaring Strike is that this is a 20-foot square, which makes it one of those spells that is in direct competition with Ensnaring Strike.
Indeed.
Why shoot a single target when you can ensnare a group of enemies?
It's a question of the damage versus getting a group. The Entangle also only entangles creatures that are in the area when the spell is cast, Afterwards, it's difficult terrain for everybody else, but it's not like web or other spells where if you get knocked into it, you're going to get restrained by the entangling vines. It's just difficult terrain. But just as with Entangling Strike, they have to make a action to make a strength check against your spell saving throw DC in order to break out afterwards. So this can be very potent battlefield control. I think the only reason why I don't see this spell more often is I don't see a lot of druids in my campaigns.
I think this is an A-tier spell.
Yeah.
I think that battlefield control is excellent, and I think this is a very early game option to tie up a group of enemies.
I think at low levels of play, Entangle is in the running for one of the strongest battlefield control spells in the game. Because it's only a first level spell slot. It does exactly what you need it to do. Entangles a group of enemies. You fight a lot of melee-oriented enemies at low levels. They're stuck there, and it creates difficult ground. If you really do compare it to Web, in many respects, because even though it is a straight-up downgrade from Web, because it doesn't re-trap people pushed into it, it's only a first-level spell slot.
And that's the thing, is like, yes, Web is your go-to battlefield control second-level spell. We'll get there.
It's also different class availability between those two spells, so it's hard to compare.
But I do think that Entangle is actually pretty great.
Is it a must-have spell for druids and rangers, which are the only two classes that can get it?
I mean, I think it's pretty high on the list of ones to deeply consider.
I do too. So I think that there is an argument that it is an S-tier spell for druids and rangers.
I think that S-tier, though, is like you would go out of your way.
Yeah, and I wouldn't go out of my way to get it.
To me, A-tier is it available to you? Put it high on your consideration list. S-tier is it not available to you? Go out of your way to find it.
Yeah, true.
So, A.
Yep. And appropriately, as we close out this episode, Expeditious Retreat.
We're going to make our Expeditious Retreat right after we talk about this spell. This is available for Sorcerers, Warlocks, Wizards, and Artificers. It's a bonus action concentration for up to 10 minutes. It gives you the ability to dash as a bonus action until the spell ends, which, is doubling your movement as a bonus action. Or if you really need to get somewhere, you can move, you can action dash, bonus action dash, and that's triple your movement. So you need to run. This is the spell for you.
So this spell is 1/3 of Cunning action as a concentration spell.
It's not that great.
It's not that bad.
No.
I just think that often one of the limitations for Expeditious Retreat is that you have to cast it on yourself as a sorcerer, warlock, wizard, or artificer. You can't cast it on somebody else, and it requires your concentration. So I think that for those classes, they're often looking at other options for mobility, especially with their bonus action. And I think for most of these classes, all of them have some sort of access to a short-range teleportation, like Misty Step. In fact, they all do.
And you're going to get that later.
You're going to get that 2 levels later at second level. That doesn't demand your concentration. So I feel like for that like mobility escape spell, this really leaves a lot to be desired.
Here's what I'll say. I don't think this is the worst spell. I don't think it's a bad spell. I've also never taken it because there's other spells that are way higher on my priority list. I think I'm going to give it a C.
I think so as well. Like, I could see some interesting character builds that utilize this, like maybe, but even then I get like, I'm like, oh, what about a low-level Blade Singer? What about a low-level Hexblade Warlock that uses it for skirmishing style play? What about, does it work on a blaster? And with almost all these characters, I want to be concentrating on something that is either going to have a really big defensive impact or a really big impact on the battle. And I could, if Expeditious Retreat was not concentration required or something along those lines, it would be Misty Step.
You think it would be broken? The way that I always wanted this spell to work is that, like Bless, you choose 3 targets, and if you upcast it, you can choose more.
If you could, if this spell could be cast on somebody else,
if it could give your whole party
bonus
action dash.
But then it would be like a weird version of haste. And this is like a weird low-level version of,
Well,
like, very limited version
It
of
would not be
haste.
nearly as powerful as haste. What I could see this used for is the party's in a situation where the Indiana Jones it and there's a
Yeah.
boulder rolling after them. And the wizard casts this spell on the whole party and they dash the heck out of there.
Yeah, I guess it's just really hard to find. It's
It's a C.
Yeah, it is.
So as we make our Expeditious Retreat, the question is, did you have different rankings for any of these spells? And tell us about some of the more niche spells and how they've been impactful in your games.
I feel like we looked at a lot of really, really niche spells today. And so if these ones came up in an interesting way in your games.
So when I give a spell C ranking, I wanna say that like I actually love niche spells, and I always have this idea that one day I'm gonna play a wizard that only takes niche spells. So I'm just a weird Swiss Army knife.
Yeah,
when
but if you have every niche, then every conceivable niche is covered.
Exactly. So I'm always excited to hear about our C ranked spells or our B ranked spells and hear about those 1 or 2 cases where you're like, oh, this broke the encounter. So please tell us about those in the comments below.
The videos that we make on our channel are made possible with the incredible generosity of our Patreon supporters. Please consider joining our Patreon and getting on our patron-only Discord server by following the links down below.
Don't forget to leave us a super thanks if you want to support our channel. And if you want to see us using some of these more niche spells, then you can check out our live play in the Worlds of Drakenheim, which is Tuesday evenings on Twitch. You can check out all the previous episodes right up over here.
And we have lots more coverage on all the spells in D&D right up over here.
Please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and ring that bell so that you never miss an episode.
Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time
In the dungeon.